In the late 19th century, the European powers got together and divided up most of Africa between them. Africa was seen as a huge, empty land without an owner, just waiting for Europe to exploit it. So they took it. The pink territories on this map became British. In the east, they got a huge piece of land which they called British East Africa, later renamed Kenya. It became part of the Great British Empire. At the beginning of this century, a quarter of the world was ruled by the British. From Canada to Australia, Africa to India, over 400 million people lived within what was then the world's greatest empire. The tiny island of Britain was a supreme world power. We're going to explore the empire in this program by following the fortunes of the Grant family, who settled in Kenya. Through their story, we can learn how the empire worked and why ultimately it ended. On the 4th of September 1913, the Grant family, Major Jocelyn, his wife Nellie and daughter Elspeth, set sail from Britain for a remote part of the British Empire called Kenya, enticed by the promise of a new life.
Win a golden return in Africa. Climate and soil alike work for the settler. Crops of all sorts flourish prolifically. Labor is cheap. The life is healthy and free from home conventions and restrictions. It is the ideal life for the energetic and enterprising.
6 weeks later, they arrive at the port of Mombasa. All around them, Kenyan produce, tea and coffee, coconuts and maize was being loaded onto ships to be sent back to Britain. Through its empire, Britain controlled 60% of the world's rubber, 50% of the world's rice, and 70% of the world's gold production. For Britain, the empire provided a ready-made market for their manufactured goods, like trains. From Mombasa, the Grants take the train to the capital, Nairobi, travelling in a first-class carriage, whites only. In Nairobi, they find much to make them feel at home. British-style hotels, churches, tea shops and banks. They soon move on to a small settlement called Thika. Here they build a house and establish a plantation to grow coffee. Land in Kenya was plentiful and cheap. Sir Harry Johnston, a colonial administrator, thought that the British were building up Kenya out of nothing.
Here we have a territory admirably suited for a white man's country, for the country in question is utterly uninhabited for miles and miles.
Sir Harry was wrong. In fact, there had been African people in the area the whites called Kenya for thousands of years, and they had a thriving culture. It seems incredible to us now, but the British drew lines across their lands and set up farms. Tribes like the Kikuyu were uprooted, even though they'd signed an agreement with the British many years before. The whites dismissed African people as unimportant savages in need of civilization. Schools, set up by missionaries, taught them about Christianity and gave them a European education to replace their tribal cultures. To the British, the way they lived and dressed seemed primitive and not worth preserving. They set about introducing them to a more British way of life. This is the interior of a traditional Kikuyu hut. And here's the British version, complete with teapot. But however much they absorbed British ways, it was understood that the white man would always remain on top. Back at Thika, the Grant family had to wait 5 years for their first crop of coffee. Adapting to the unfamiliar conditions of their adopted country wasn't easy, as Nellie Grant recalls.
7th of April. Got back to a terrific locust invasion and a grass fire, and still no signs of the rain. The heat and dust and dryness are foul beyond words. 10th of September. The damned locusts come every day now. Not a sign of rain either.
Despite the setbacks, the farm earned the Grants up to £25 a month. Not a lot by British standards, but in Kenya at that time, that money went a long way. The wealthier British colonists were able to enjoy a standard of living that they would never have had in Britain. Cocktails at the Blue Posts Hotel. And parties until the African dawn. And then it was off on safari to shoot the local wildlife. By the 1930s, the Grants were able to afford a new bungalow and employ servants. The Grants liked and treated their servants well. Nellie's photograph of Karanga and Mabagwa has the air of a family snapshot. Life in the Empire could be rewarding if you were white.
As long as the world goes round and round, something goes on.
Most people in Britain had never seen a Kenyan in the flesh, nor any other person with real black skin.
Men with red noses will still brave the weather. Dear little babies will smile.
If they weren't being portrayed as savages, then black people were most likely to be seen as harmless figures of fun. It is therefore not surprising that Britain's right to rule overseas wasn't seriously questioned. These attitudes were ingrained from birth. Every year, school children celebrated Empire Day.
I want to tell you, children, that you are, each one of you, a member of the Empire, and when you sing that you're proud of the Empire, I want you to feel that you're proud of yourself.
It was celebrated with songs, marches and pageants in which the tallest girl in the school dressed up as Britannia. The others, representing the countries of the Empire, paid homage to their ruler. People would find reminders of Britain's world status in their everyday lives. You could buy exotic goods imported from the colonies, or visit an Empire theatre or cinema.
From Nairobi in Kenya comes another happy picture of British celebrations in a distant territory of empire.
The truth was that by the 1930s, looking after and defending such a huge empire was becoming difficult. A large part of the Navy was employed to protect its far-flung territories, and a third of Britain's army was tied up in India alone. People in the Empire were beginning to question Britain's right to rule them. And threats of this nature were dealt with harshly.
The garden party at Government House is the social event of the celebrations, which exhibit a characteristic temper of intense loyalty.
Back in Britain, though, the empire was shown to be peaceful, happy, and set to last for centuries. It didn't. The empire proved indispensable to Britain during the war. It provided ports, naval bases, and above all, soldiers. Africans, Asians, Caribbeans, Canadians, New Zealanders and others fought enthusiastically side by side with the British. Even so, the old prejudices were hard for the British to discard. A Times article from 1940 concluded the African races were
considered to be the more backward of mankind, and yet they show the same spontaneity and true understanding of the issue. They know that the empire of which they are members is being challenged, and they are eager in their simple way to help in defending it.
Even when sons of Africa were dying for Britain, some people still could not bring themselves to see Africans as equals. After the war, Britain's grip on the empire began to slip. Britain was bankrupt and no longer a supreme power, able to control an empire. In this exhausted Britain, attitudes were at last beginning to change. People wanted to rebuild the country into a fairer society. Holding on to the empire didn't fit in with this. When the United Nations was formed, all countries, including Britain, agreed to a Declaration of Human Rights, saying that all men and women, black and white, were equal.
Nation by nation, the delegates stand up for the great new charter they hammered out together. 50 nations standing side by side, unanimous for peace.
The idea of a small country like Britain holding on to a vast empire suddenly seemed out of step with the rest of the world. Back in Kenya, the Grant's fortunes were declining. Old Major Grant, a veteran of 2 world wars, died in 1947. Nellie keeps on the farm, but the Kenya around her is changing. "97,000 Kenyans had fought in the war and seen the world outside. Many returned to menial jobs and poverty. African nationalists protested. Africa for the Africans, they said. An independence movement was born. Its aim was to unite all the Kenyan tribes into one nation. At its head was Jomo Kenyatta.
Surely, if we are considered fit enough to take our rifles and fight side by side with white men, we have a right to a direct say in the running of our country.
Some young Africans took to arms. The British government offered £5 a head for anybody who could shoot these people whom the settlers call Mau Mau. Africans who fought for the British were seen by the Mau Mau as traitors and became targets for some of their worst atrocities.
First films of the horrible Mau Mau massacre near Nairobi in Kenya. An entire village turned into a smoking funeral pyre for more than 150 Kikuyu tribesmen. Only a handful survived this highly organized night raid.
The media focused on Mau Mau atrocities rather than the issue of independence. Allegations of British mistreatment of Mau Mau prisoners went unreported.
Meanwhile, colonial police spring into action after this latest and bloodiest Mau Mau uprising, rounding up a total of 500 natives suspected of belonging to the dread secret society. Barbarians who have shown that they will slaughter even their fellow tribesmen in their pledge to drive the white man from Kenya.
The Mau Mau became a very real threat to the isolated white settlers. Nellie discovered that even Karanga, her cook, had Mau Mau connections. She was worried.
9th of October 1952. On Tuesday, Poor old Chief Waruhiu got murdered, and another European woman stabbed to death, making the second in a fortnight. So now I'm taking the firearm question seriously and going to the police to be told how to load my revolver.
White settlers struggled to preserve their pre-war way of life, in spite of the real situation in Kenya. But homegrown militia and armed settlers could not cope. British troops poured into Kenya. It seemed that the old guard of the empire still held on, now hopelessly out of step with world opinion. Even back in Britain, people started to question whether all this conflict was justifiable. In the struggle for Kenyan independence, 11,500 Mau Mau were killed. 167 British soldiers and 1,800 civilians, mostly black, also died. Enough was enough.
Uhuru, independence for Kenya. In line here, Mr. Duncan Sands, Mr. Malcolm MacDonald, the new Governor-General, and Jomo Kenyatta, ex-Mau Mau leader, now Prime Minister.
Britain said farewell to its colony peacefully, but not without first reminding it of its debt to Britain.
Reminds us that it's with a British system of law and government that Kenya looks to the future. A time of rejoicing, not surprisingly mingled with some regret. Many Europeans who've grown up with Kenya now regard themselves among the dispossessed.
On the 12th of December 1963, the flag is lowered on British Kenya and African Kenya is born. Some white farmers prepare to give up. For Nellie Grant, it means giving up all she has lived and worked for.
I feel very bitterly and deeply about being such an infinitely poor relation, crawling home and being a nuisance. Politics raging, of course. It really hardly does bear thinking of. The near future, I mean.
But 80-year-old Nellie Grant stays on for 2 years before selling her farm for £900 to her old Kikuyu workers. All the possessions she takes with her are packed into the same 3 trunks she arrived with in 1913. In 80 years, the people of Kenya had been on a difficult journey that took them from freedom to colonialism to independence. The future of Africa was at last back in African hands. Kenya was the last part of the empire that Britain tried to hang on to by force. Little by little, the empire that had once controlled a quarter of the world peeled away, leaving the island of Britain just another country on the map. This episode of History File was produced in Cardiff by BBC Wales. It was devised and created by this especially assembled team of actors, musicians, designers, technicians and programme makers, and narrated by me, Juliet Stevenson. The executive producer was Mr. Di Williams.
Watcher!